Hello, everyone. And full disclosure, this is the first lecture I've ever recorded using this software. So bear with me and we'll see how things go. Um, but if we're going to spend an entire class talking about cannabis, I think we really ought to know something about its history. And so often we ignore history, but there's really wisdom to be learned in these ancient practices, and there's mistakes people have made we can learn about and ideally not repeat. Now, if we didn't watch it in class or you haven't watched it yet, I recommend actually pausing this and going back first to watch the video, Everything We Know About Getting High is Wrong. You'll find it in the cannabis history module under week one. It's just 10 minutes and gives some great context for how substances have been used throughout history and really not just used, but considered, and reminding us that really the last 100 years is the anomaly in terms of how we think about a variety of intoxicating substances. So let's move on to cannabis history. I want to orient you to this timeline. Uh, You'll see on the far left, I have 6000 BCE. And on the right, I have today, 2023 CE. And just to give you, make sure those terms are familiar to you, BCE stands for before the Common Era, and CE stands for Common Era. These are kind of replacement terms for what was typically and commonly used as BC, before zero, and AD, after zero. And those terms are only really have meaning to those who practice Christian faith. So BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, which starts after zero, the Common Era, are more inclusive terms there. And then I have 1937 on here. I have that because 1937 is essentially the year that we consider formal prohibition to have taken place in the United States. And that prohibition really quickly spread throughout the world and became the dominant global policy throughout the rest of the 20th century. And of course, remains the policy in many places, both in the United States and throughout the world, even today in 2023. And one of the things that we're going to learn in the grand scheme of history, the 20th and 21st centuries are really very different when it comes to cannabis, and even other substances, comparing it to everything that came before it. This era of mass prohibition is pretty unique to this past 100 or so years. And we'll see that there were thousands of years of humans all over the globe using cannabis in different ways. And this period of prohibition starting in 1937 is really just a small blip when you look at the scope of history. And as you saw, if you watched the video I mentioned, humans have been consuming cannabis and other intoxicating substances for thousands of years. To really dig deep into the long, rich history of cannabis consumption, take a look at some of the additional resources. I especially recommend the video. It's about an hour long, although I've run it at 1.25 and 1.5 speed. And it still works pretty well if you want to go through it quicker, but it really digs deeper into the history of cannabis consumption. So if we go back 6000 BCE, and remember that's 6000 years before zero, so we're talking 8,000 years ago. I chose this as a starting point. Um, this is when we first start to know that cannabis was being used for food and fiber. And I chose 6000 BCE, although some researchers think that the starting point may even be 5,000 years earlier than that. Carl Sagan, who was a famous scientist, historian, and TV personality throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and I think died in the late 2000s, he theorized that cannabis might have even have been the first cultivated human crop. Again, we don't have a lot of information. We're talking thousands of years ago, but regardless, at a minimum, over 8,000 years ago, humans were already using cannabis as a food and a fiber. It's possible that it was being used for medicinal or intoxicating effects, but we really just don't have the evidence to say that. Cannabis seeds more commonly known now as hemp seeds, are really one of the most nutritious foods on the planet, having complete protein and healthy fats. And likewise, cannabis fiber, as we'll see touched on later, is one of the most valued and strongest fibers that exists. So again, we know 6000 BCE, we're using cannabis as food and fiber across a variety of human populations, primarily in the East. And then the next date I want to highlight is 2737 BCE. Now, again, this is still almost 5,000 years ago. And this is really the first documentation that cannabis is being used as a medicine. It was listed in Emperor Shen Yun, excuse the pronunciation, Shen Yun's Pharmacopoeia. And a pharmacopoeia is basically a book that describes all the medicines that are being used and what they're being used for. Emperor Jung is considered the father of traditional Chinese medicine, and he listed a wide range of conditions for which cannabis is used, and that includes joint pain, menstrual problems, and even neurologic issues. Now, cannabis as a medicine and a spiritual tool was common outside of China as well. Ayurvedic texts, which come from India, and their sacred Hindu texts, are another source describing the importance of cannabis to that society. Cannabis is mentioned as one of the 5 sacred plants of India and was used for a wide range of medicinal and religious reasons. The Hindu god Shiva is supposedly a lover of cannabis, and there's still a holiday festival every year where intoxicating cannabis is consumed all throughout India. Now, of course, cannabis has been prohibited in India, just like most other places this last 100 years, but the Indian government just kind of forgets that prohibition exists and doesn't enforce prohibition during this festival every year, and you'll see all kinds of costumes and rituals associated with this festival still in India today. While we know cannabis was valued from ancient writings, such as described above, we now, in recent years, have seen some archaeologic evidence confirming that cannabis was being consumed. And specifically, we found evidence of THC dominant cannabis being used. And this really shows us that the intoxicating properties of cannabis were valued for spiritual and probably medicinal purposes as well. So the earliest evidence we have of ritual burning of cannabis goes back 750 years before the Common Era, and this is biblical times. The Hebrew Bible, otherwise known as the Old Testament in the Christian religion, this is the era of biblical times. So kind of take a moment and find yourself a priest back in ancient Israel. Now, you're one of the leaders of the Jewish people at that time. And in your temple, only you have access to the holiest place in the temple. It's called the Holy of Holies. It's a tiny, tiny enclosed space, just big enough for one person. And it's the place you go where you believe you can access God. And in that Holy of Holies, in that small space, there's staying 2 altars. And on those altars, on one altar, you take THC rich cannabis oil. And on the other, you take frankincense oil. And you light those oils and burn those oils, and the vapors really fill the space as you sit in there and you breathe them in this tiny space with this burning oil and the vapors being created. And presumably, you're getting pretty intoxicated. Now, for those who have a knowledge of modern cannabis slang, basically the Hebrew priest during this time is basically hotboxing. And this is in the most holy of places, where this priest would be, likely supported by significant intoxication, where he would attempt to communicate with his God at the time. And this is what we found in the altars of a well-preserved temple site in ancient Israel. And while we can't say anything with certainty, the findings of THC and frankincense residue on these altars in this well-preserved temple suggests this was more commonplace than previously thought. Now, some have argued, even based on biblical interpretation, that cannabis was a constituent in the anointing oil that was used both throughout the Hebrew Bible, again, the Old Testament, and in the books written as Christianity developed, which now are, called the New Testament. And really, it's beyond the scope of this course. But if anyone interested in learning more about cannabis in biblical times, reach out to me and I can pass on some interesting resources. Now, cannabis was also known and utilized in ancient times in the West, and presumably most commonly as a medicine. In 70 of the Common Era, a Greek physician, Dioscorides, he compiled a pharmacopoeia. And again, the pharmacopoeia is a book which lists all the most, used medicines of the time. And this pharmacopoeia that was written in 70 CE became the most well-known pharmacologic textbook. It was really used for over 1,500 years, and cannabis was included in his writings. So we know both from that text and other texts that were around that cannabis was at least used somewhat for medicinal purposes around Greek and Roman times, which we kind of consider the start of Western Europe, modern kind of Western European history. Now, we're going to jump forward about 2,000 years and talk about cannabis history in Western Europe and the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries, kind of what we might call our modern time of cannabis history. But before I do that, I want to say that certainly by no means did cannabis disappear during these 2,000 years. So cannabis remained common in a wide range of cultures, primarily in the East and Middle East, where it was used for medicinal, spiritual, and commercial applications. Commercial meaning the food and fiber. And in fact, it really wasn't till America exported kind of prohibition in the 20th century where cannabis went underground or even potentially disappeared in many of these cultures. And cannabis was present in Europe throughout this time, but not intoxicating varieties, not higher THC varieties. So low THC cannabis, which we now know of as hemp, was really a staple crop in Europe. And really most notably, hemp fiber was used to create the sails of ships, which powered the period of European naval exploration that began in the 1400s, and of course colonization of large swaths of the planet that followed from that. And in fact, low THC cannabis or hemp cannabis was also a staple crop in America, in the United States of America during colonial and revolutionary times, and grown by former presidents George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, amongst others. Early drafts of the Declaration of Independence were written on hemp paper, and the original Betsy Ross United States flag was sewn from hemp fiber. Now, again, despite what you may read, to my knowledge, there's no evidence that our former presidents or other folks in the area that became the United States were using THC-rich cannabis or using intoxicating cannabis in our area, although, as I'll mention later, THC-rich cannabis was introduced and became more common in Latin American countries. But for the most part, when we're talking about Europe and the area that is now the United States of America, THC-rich cannabis, or really any evidence of consuming cannabis for intoxication, pretty much, was gone for those 2,000 years, or at least as far as we know. But then what we find right around 1800, beginning of the 19th century, THC-rich cannabis shows up again in Europe. And from there, we can really follow a fairly clear path of cannabis history and how we got to the era of prohibition and now today into the area of increased legalization. And just to go back again, seeing this whole timeline, again, this area from 1937 forward is just a blip in this broad history of the use of cannabis amongst humans. So let's kind of review cannabis in Western society. In Western society, I'm kind of calling Europe and the United States. And we'll kind of talk about a little bit how cannabis was being used, how it came back into being common, and what was occurring leading up to when Prohibition took place. And then next week, we're going to definitely explore the criminalization of cannabis in the Prohibition era in depth. So, as we get into the 18 and 1900s, as I mentioned, hemp fiber was a staple, and it certainly continued to be a staple. Hemp was extremely valuable and didn't really start disappearing until cannabis prohibition laws started coming into place in the first few decades of the 1900s. Now, intoxicating cannabis first makes it back into Europe right around 1800. So the French were fighting in Egypt at the time, troops under a young general named Napoleon, who, for anyone who knows history, went on to greater stardom in France, but certainly not the topic of this class. But Napoleon and his army were in Egypt, certainly exposed to cannabis use, primarily in the form of hashish, which was the kind of form of choice in the Middle East there. And many in his army, and there was also a contingent of scientists that were with his troops. They were exposed to hashish, to cannabis, and they brought it back to them when they went back to France around 1800, 1801. And kind of after its reintroduction in Europe, it's kind of developed a small but notable kind of recreational consumption period that was kind of centered in France during that time. And we're talking again the early 1800s. The most famous of these kind of recreational circles was probably the group called the Club de Hashishins, I believe is the appropriate pronunciation, which I think I just butchered, but we'll just go with that. So this was in Paris in the 1840s, and this was a group where a bunch of famous authors and other elites of the city, with such names as Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, and Charles Baudelaire, who are famous writers. Me being a science person and not reading a lot of 1800s European literature, I am not terribly familiar with them, although I do know Victor Hugo was who wrote Les Miserables, which became a famous play in modern times. Nonetheless, I digress. But all these famous authors and elites would meet regularly and consume fairly copious amounts, it appears, of edible cannabis, and then write about their experiences. Um, and this picture that hopefully is showing up on the screen uh, was taken by me actually last year. And this is the front doors of the Hotel de Lauzun. Again, excuse the pronunciation, but this is in the heart of Paris, maybe a 10-minute walk from Notre Dame. And this is the hotel where these gentlemen met regularly. And again, from their writings and descriptions, it sounds like they were consuming pretty hefty edible doses of cannabis, which, as we'll talk later on in this course, uh, can certainly be associated with some adverse effects and anxiety and paranoia and so on and so forth. And it really is an interesting story. And if you have the time and the interest, there's a podcast in the additional resources about this topic, interviewing the host of another podcast called Great Moments in Weed History, where they go through the wide breadth of cannabis history. It's that podcast I highly recommend, but it's really designed to give great history, but also designed for those who are regular cannabis consumers. If you're not, it might get a little annoying with some of the puns and the jokes. But again, there's a great episode about this Club de Hashishins, and again, the interview in your resources goes over just some of aspects of human consumption. Now, our modern Western use of cannabis as medicine can really be traced back to one man. His name was William O'Shaughnessy. Now, O'Shaughnessy was a British doctor and a scientist who served in India under various capacities, both militarily and scientifically. And while he was in India, he saw the Indians' use of cannabis. Again, as I mentioned earlier, cannabis was one of the five sacred plants of India. It's been part of Ayurvedic medicine, the Indian medical system, for thousands of years. And O'Shaughnessy saw the Indians using cannabis and was blown away. He saw all these healing properties for conditions that he had no options to treat. And not only that, he writes about in conditions where people were dying, like tetanus, which is an infection people were getting. Cannabis didn't cure tetanus by any means, but even in the patients who were dying of tetanus, they were given cannabis, and he saw how much it improved their quality of life for whatever time they had back and their mood. And so he started researching it. He went on to perform numerous experiments in India using cannabis. He performed experiments first in dogs and then performed experiments in humans showing benefits for a wide range of conditions. And then he went on to publish an 800-page review discussing the history of cannabis, the botany of cannabis, and then all his research that he did. And so this book was published in 1839 in India, and eventually, a couple of years later, it was published in England. And then he came back to England and gave numerous lectures on the benefits of cannabis medicine. And really, from there, cannabis pretty quickly became more commonly used among doctors in Europe and the United States. And you could really look at it as kind of going viral, so to speak. I mean, just within a few years of O'Shaughnessy writing his book and talking to folks in Europe, medical cannabis exploded. And over the next, say, 70 years or so, it became a staple for physicians. It was used to treat a wide range of conditions. It was typically given in a tincture. True tincture is actually an alcohol extract, although we use the term tincture today to talk about kind of any oil-based extract. But if you've ever seen a picture of a Western English trained physician from around the turn of the 20th century, it's usually a man with a black suit carrying a black medical bag, and I guarantee you could almost be positive there was cannabis tincture in that black medical bag for patients. Again, cannabis medicines were sold over the counter around the turn of the century, as were all medicines of the day back then. And again, it was used for a wide range of conditions, and these, not surprisingly, overlap with how we use cannabis today. So things like pain or seizures or insomnia, sleep problems were some of the main reasons people were using cannabis. Now, we don't initially see too much smoking of cannabis flower used amongst Europeans or in the English-speaking areas of the Western Hemisphere. However, cannabis also flourished in Latin America. So it was introduced into the Western Hemisphere by Spanish colonizers, and a lot of the indigenous groups incorporated cannabis into their cultures and into their routines. And often smoking was a much more common method of consumption, both for medicinal and spiritual purposes. And after events taking place in Mexico, there was a significant Mexican immigration to the United States in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. And so Americans were to some extent exposed to recreational smoking. And this recreational smoking really kind of clustered primarily in the jazz music community. And that community was, of course, dominated by African Americans. So the use of smoked cannabis amongst these two minority groups, Mexican immigrants and African Americans, becomes very important next week as we move on to talking about cannabis prohibition, and really sets the stage for the development of prohibition, and even more importantly, sets the stage for the impacts cannabis prohibition has had on minority groups, especially on Hispanic and Black communities in the United States. So thanks for sticking around for this kind of quick summary of cannabis history. Of course, there's much more in the additional resources for week one. Don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions you have. I'm available before class for office hours, or just connect with me online and we can set up another time to talk about things. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of the day or night or morning whenever you're watching this.